Okay, so I'd like to begin by inviting Dr. Catherine McGregor, the Associate Dean, Graduate Programs and Research in the Faculty of Education, to speak to us as we begin our first session. She's going to introduce the Symposium series, talk a little bit about the rationale behind it, and also give us a bit of background on the inspiration for the title, Pandemic Storms. So welcome, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Tanya. And it really is my pleasure to be here today with the first in our series of Symposium, the one we entitled Pandemic Storms, Pause, Reflect, and Act. And I'm going to talk briefly about why we chose that as the title for our symposium series. But first, I think it's important to let participants know that one of the responsibilities we take really seriously in our faculty is to support researchers and the work of educational research. And so about a year ago, with support from research services at UVic, we created a research fund that was devoted to exploring the impacts of COVID-19 on communities, cultures, and social locations. It's important because as educational researchers, we really understand the power education offers to individuals, groups, and societies, and we wanted to find ways to use this, the power of education to inform practices both now and in the future. So we called the symposium Pandemic Storms, because we're right in the middle, we're in the center of that pandemic storm, but we also want to take the opportunity to pause, reflect, and act. And so now is the first in a series of 4 events where we're going to talk to researchers about the reflections on their learning, about what they found out, and how they can use this information to affect positive change. So today's session begins with Dr. Fred Chou and his colleague, Macayla Yan, and I think that's a great kickoff to our event, and I'm certainly looking forward to hearing more about his work. And I'm hoping that you'll consider joining us for the full series. This is the first week, and each Wednesday at lunchtime, you can join us for other sessions where we share learning during the pandemic. So thanks, Tanya.
Okay, great. Thanks for that introduction, Catherine. And so I'd like to introduce our session today and presenters. The title of today's session is COVID-19 and Mental Health Resources for Asians in Canada. Our presenters are Dr. Fred Chou and Macayla Yan. Dr. Fred Chou is an assistant professor in counseling psychology in the Department of Educational Psychology and Leadership Studies at the University of Victoria and a registered psychologist. His research interests include the mental health of Asian Canadians, intergenerational trauma, and youth mental health promotion and literacy. As a community-based researcher, he specializes in using participatory and narrative research methodologies. Macayla Yan is a Cantonese settler residing on Lekwungen homelands, recently known as Victoria, BC. Macayla is the primary author of the Cultivating Growth and Solidarity zine, and is currently working on their Master's of Counseling Psychology at the University of Victoria with the goal of serving marginalized and equity-deserving communities. Macayla believes in the necessity of individual, collective, and ancestral healing and liberation. So please join me in welcoming Fred and Macayla for their presentation on COVID-19 and mental health resources for Asians in Canada.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's always nice to just be introduced. And I usually don't get that experience. Usually I have to introduce myself. So that's really quite nice. So thank you for this, providing us with this space. Thank you for the Faculty of Education for funding this research project. And also just, I'm really encouraged to see folks here just to have an opportunity to, as was mentioned, the theme, pause, reflect, and learn and act together. So I'm just going to start the PowerPoint slide here. I think I do have the screen shared here. I do also want to say that right before this, I had some internet issues. So if I pause awkwardly, this something to do with my internet. And then I also want to name that I have a baby that's transitioning from 1 nap to 2 naps, and it's not deciding which naps they want to do. And so you might hear an occasional screeching, and that's nothing to be concerned about. It's just a baby boy. I want to also say that broadly, what we're going to be presenting on is this project that we've had the privilege to engage in, and it's a little bit unique in the sense that it's not so much data gathering or anything like that, but we when COVID-19 happened, there was a lot of anti-Asian racism that was happening at the time. And so when we were kind of seeing what was happening and that particular storm, we really wanted to create something that would be helpful for the community. And just like navigating a storm, you can imagine how you may have one plan in mind, and you kind of have to adapt and change according to the different obstacles that are thrown in front of you. And so what we're going to present here, yes, it started off as kind of this idea to create mental health resources, but then it kind of shifted and changed as we were kind of navigating the pandemic storm as a research team.
All right. So yeah, I know that we already had a land acknowledgement, but we thought it would be important for us to do one as well. So I want to acknowledge that I'm tuning in from the Lekwungen territories, but with this Zoom world, people could be coming from across the land, and so I just want to take a moment for us to be with this land. Right here, I have a picture of camas, and the camas are blooming right now on the Lekwungen territories, and they're such a gorgeous flower. And I just think about how deep and how old the relationships with this land are, how camas is a very intentionally cultivated plant, and how this land has centuries of stories. And so if it helps, you can close your eyes and just think about the people who have played on this land, the people who have told stories and who've created art and who've cried and who've held each other and who have just stories and stories of the plants, of the animals, of the waters and the mountains, wherever you may be. And I hope you can hold that in your heart and your spirit throughout this presentation, but also beyond. Thank you.
Thanks, Macayla. Appreciate that way of situating us. And again, I want to start that what we want to try to describe here is more of situating this project and really an explanation about how we navigated this particular storm, the storm of anti-Asian racism, which continues to persist. That's connected to this COVID-19 storm. And so we want to describe our project as to more of a kind of a narrative in invitation and hopes, as this is just an example, because I know all of you are kind of navigating it in your own ways, navigating these really important race talks that we're having right now, navigating the stressors associated with the pandemic. And so, we hope that this can be just an example, and we want to kind of give a lot of space at the end of our presentation or towards the end of our presentation, just for us to talk, to just learn from each other, because I feel like we get the privilege of being able to share, but I think there's so much to also learn from one another about how each of you have been navigating, and we just hope that this could be just one of those examples. So we want to just talk about the project first. We'll go into a little bit of the context of anti-Asian racism, and then we're going to introduce one of the key resources that we developed out of this project. And originally it was meant to be a mental health resource, but during that time, it was some very significant things. You had the George Floyd murder and a need to really talk about important things like anti-racism. And so what we developed was a anti-racism and mental health zine for Asian youth. And then we'll try and talk a little bit about our reflections about that and kind of give some space for discussion. before I jump into kind of the narrative, I do want to highlight that even though Macayla and I are here, there was a collective that was part of this journey. And so I want to acknowledge Kui-sun, who's over at UBC right now, Professor Jin-sun Yoon, who's at Child and Youth Care at UVic, Dr. Catherine Costigan in clinical psychology at UVic, and Dr. Nancy Clark, who's in nursing at UVic. And also we had the privilege of working with a youth advisory, and these were all the members who contributed their insights into the zine that we ended up creating for this project. Jenilyn, Kate, Maya, and Rael. So as I was kind of started out, what really led to this particular project, and as I kind of alluded to, there was a lot of this anti-Asian racism that was happening, and it was personal. There was another member in the team who had experienced some very explicit racism, just walking by and statements that were directed towards them. I had a lot of other friends and colleagues of Asian descent also experiencing racism, and a lot of reflections about my own experiences of racism. And so, we wanted to do something, this colleague and I, and we kind of decided to just, let's come together. There was this grant that was available from the Faculty of Education. Let's just put something together. And coming from counseling psychology, let's just situate it within mental health. And as I mentioned, during that time, again, it was a little bit more than a year ago that there was a George Floyd's murder and the significant movement in the Black Lives Matter and more of this discussion about racism and anti-racism. And so, in my own kind of narcissism, thinking that it's all just about mental health, the research team really kind of pushed back and said, we really need to look at other things too. It's not just mental health. Mental health is a piece of this, but we have to talk about racism. And whatever we're developing here too can't just be a COVID-19 resource. COVID-19 was the context of this. And our hope was to create something that could have some more of a lasting impact that could be useful to the community. And so what really emerged out of that was a key piece of this, which was an anti-racism and mental health resource, which was a zine, because we really wanted that to be useful for the youth community. And so our project, in terms of things that we engage in, we connected consultative community, we engaged in literature review, we created a publication for psychologists, and the idea was to have this generally available for counselors and other clinicians in the mental health field, just to be more aware of issues around anti-Asian racism, anti-Chinese racism. And again, the kind of the main piece of what we developed was this zine.
Yeah, so just to provide a little bit of context, anti-Asian racism didn't pop up with COVID-19, that there is a long history of it on this land and internationally. It just became heightened or more explicit in this time. And so, yeah, we want to acknowledge that it's propped up by centuries of anti-Asian racism and xenophobia. So there is the narrative of the yellow pearl, where Asian people are seen as diseased outsiders. There's lots of Canadian history with the head tax, with Japanese internment, with the Chinese Exclusion Act, the racism that came with the SARS outbreak, as you can see in the cartoon here, international politics and militarization. How many occupations in Asia has there been by Western nations? And then also associated concepts of the perpetual foreigner myth and the model minority myth, where the perpetual foreigner is this idea that Asian people are always outsiders to Canadian society and culture. And the model minority myth positions Asians as, the good minorities, the ones who can succeed and do well in school, and prove that, these other bad minorities don't know how to get their act together. And then also all of this is in the context of settler colonialism, where one of the main foundations of settler colonialism is to take the land and to replace the indigenous peoples of this land. And that has always been a white supremacist project of nation building. And so Asian labor has been foundational, especially in BC, to creating infrastructure for this project, and yet not being fully included in it due to racism and xenophobia. And so it's a very layered and complex and historied, yeah, just system that we're working with and living in.
So what does that look like in the current context? And so, and that history continues. And as Macayla mentioned, it's not a new thing, but rather, and not in some ways you could say it's elevated, but maybe uncovered things that were always there. And so the current landscape, there was some really good work that was done by some advocate groups, including Eliminate COVIDRacism.ca, Project 1907, and they were compiling the racism that was happening. And there was also a report from the Vancouver Police Department that showed that anti-Asian hate crimes increased over 700% in the greater Vancouver area. The reports of self-reports, incidents of anti-Asian racism were over 1,000, 1,150. And this was just a recent report that was published in March. And part of that, there is, as you kind of remember from the last slide, there is kind of a gendered piece to this racism. 60% identified as female, 48% of them were adults. The racism that was involved was verbal harassment, and 22% of it was physical assault, whether that be physical violence, pushing, shoving, or being spat at. And the reason why we want to also focus on this mental health piece was 73% of the folks who reported this racism experienced mental distress. So I don't need to go into the literature in terms of why racism is bad, but there is a lot of research that shows racism is bad. And it's blatantly obvious. There have been many meta-analyses. One of the more prominent ones was the one that's conducted by Paradis, which looked at 293 studies that found that racism was associated with poor mental health, with poor physical health. And plenty of studies that also looked at Asian populations in terms of the association between racism and mental distress.
So why a zine? First, zines are self-published works for sharing ideas and opinions. You can see some examples here, including the zine that we created in the top right corner. We wanted to create resources for youth, and so zines are much more accessible for a wider audience. I remember when Fred said, let's just make like a 2-pager on mental health for youth. And I thought, what youth is going to read this? So we wanted to create something that was engaging, interactive, and a zine was a great avenue for that. Jinsun actually was the first one who suggested it because she was inspired by the Asian American Feminist Antibodies zine. And so zines are deeply political. They're embedded in lived experiences and open spaces for public discourse. They're a form of knowledge translation that is resistant towards, the elitist ivory tower academic way of sharing knowledge. And so lots of zines have been created over decades around anti-racism. There's lots of feminist zines and zines around mental health and wellness. And so as a team, we definitely thought this would be the ideal avenue for us to share a resource for youth.
It's a deeply helping experience for me as the PI, because I actually didn't know what a zine was. And when people proposed it, I was like, yeah, let's just do a zine. And I think in my mind, it was an infographic. So that's why in my mind, I was like, yeah, 2 pages should be sufficient. And again, this kind of speaks about, I think it was a journey, like the journey of this navigating the storms and thinking about how do we actually make something that would be really beneficial. And but part of it was, you know, our own reflections around, you know, we were all being thrown into these discussions about racism, which were always happening, but became at the forefront. And how do we kind of navigate these intersections between racism, anti-racism, mental health, mental wellness? And in some ways, the zine became a very valuable tool, not only for getting to look at those intersections, but our own reflections. And so they were kind of, you know, we weren't just kind of going at this, without any sort of framework. There was a kind of theoretical underpinning that we had in mind. At the heart of this is we wanted to approach this from a critical pedagogical standpoint in terms of not necessarily being put onto others, but our own process of, and this comes from Freire, our own process of critical reflexivity and action and social action, and our reflections about our own experiences of racism, our own experiences of its tie to mental health, and the zine really being a representation of that social action that was embodied in those lived experiences. It was situated within some of the advocacy and social justice movements within counseling psychology, and as well as anti-oppressive and intersectional perspectives that we wanted to make sure was being bounded into whatever was being produced. And just within kind of similar within kind of critical pedagogy, which emphasizes a more dialogical approach, we wanted it to be a very relational process. So our team really thought of this as a co-constructive process, that we were engaged in this relationally because whatever we were producing had to reflect our values, had to reflect our experiences. And so we intentionally made it into a very deep and personal process and shared decisions as we went through this and created this together. Macayla could share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I remember one of the first meetings we had as a team. There was a lot happening in the world. It was at the height of a lot of Black Lives Matter actions, and it was just a lot of heaviness happening around us. And I remember Fred making space for us to unpack it and debrief it together in a way that, someone else might think it's not productive or we're not meeting our agenda items, but it was the foundation of our relationships and the works that we did together. And in many ways, it provided the space for us to create an even more powerful product, the zine. And so, yeah, just challenging the idea of being really productive with our meetings and creating space for relationship building. Yeah, so I'm really grateful for that space. I think it provided just like such a beautiful foundation for the zine.
Thanks, Macayla. And really that idea of this project not producing necessarily focusing on the outcome, but really focusing on intentionality, because we knew that engaging in these topics were incredibly difficult as we were kind of putting it out into the world, but for all of us. And so I think part of that really reflects, if you read some of Freire's work and others, that space, that intentional space to reflect about the ways that oppression becomes internalized and embodied, and being able to, in some ways, make that explicit and play with that and take something that is potentially and horrendous and horrible, and make it into something that could be a creative endeavor. And so, Macayla, trying to share a little bit about what this zine looks like.
Yeah, we really created the zine together. I mean, we've all had experiences of all of us on the team have been Asian youth at some point. And so, you know, coming from that lens. And so we wanted to create something that was interactive, educational, and rooted in anti-racism for youth, although open to everyone. And we also recognize that not everyone in a youth's life would know how to have these conversations. So we created a facilitation guide for adults, which is actually the Youth Advisory Committee's idea. So we wanted to bring theory and practice in an accessible format to help readers make sense of their own experiences in the systems we live in. We didn't think that these concepts should be only for people who have a certain amount of education, that everyone deserves to understand what, for example, intersectionality means and how that relates to their own life. And so the zine really considers mental health, holistic wellness, and racial identity within larger contexts, particularly settler colonialism and land, because we can't separate those things. Racism is directly related to settler colonialism. And so we wanted to start off right away with positioning ourselves as settlers, as occupiers on this land, and what does that mean when so much of anti-Asian racism is about not belonging, but what are we trying to belong to, and what does that mean, and who has relationships on these lands. So yeah, that was really, really important for us. And so, yeah, of course, although it was created with Asian youth in mind, others would definitely benefit from the zine, including adults, including people who aren't Asian, and ultimately as a project of love and humanization. And for me, humanization means, you know, we're going to make mistakes, we're not going to be perfect, and we should be allowed to have room to be imperfect humans. And so, yeah, we really explored themes like, you know, right here it says, where are you from? Which is a pretty common question Asian people and racialized people in general get quite a lot. And how can we look at it from a different perspective where we can find power in our ancestry and feel really connected in ways that internalized racism and settler colonialism doesn't necessarily want us to do. And so we wanted to give room to engage in exploration, reflection, and not assuming that essentially that there is so much diversity within this label of Asian. And so being really mindful and open and specific also, that we all have specific ancestries. Like my family comes from Khoisan, and what does that mean for me? And some Asians are mixed backgrounds, and what does that mean for them? And so, yeah, we have lots of reflective questions throughout the zine. The next slide has some excerpts. So we ask about positionality from an intersectional perspective. We ask about, you know, what was it like to experience a microaggression from someone? How did it impact you? How can you be accountable for the harm you cause? Because we can make mistakes and say hurtful things. And then how can we dream up a future together? Because we wanted to leave it on a note where this is, you know, like what we inherited. This is a society that we live in, but we can dream up something different. We can create communities of care and of real solidarity and accountability. And so we also wanted to make room for possibility, especially for youth, because youth are so creative, and that's something that I love about working with youth. And so, yeah, people are taking the zine in so many different places. Teachers are using it with elementary and secondary students. Zines are being used at UVic Camosun and McGill in the States. We just found out today that Dr. Lisa Gunderson used the zine in a PAC meeting last week. So it's really exciting to see how far the zine is going and how many people are really resonating with it. And also to hear that the zine is inspiring other people to create their own, to share knowledge within academia and community. So it's really, really exciting to see it grow and spread. It's very hopeful for me.
And so, I mean, if you do want access to the zine, you can find it on our website, the www.growthandsolidarity.ca. And I just wanted to kind of briefly kind of touch upon, what came out of this this project and what are the next steps. As Macayla, really appreciate the way that Macayla kind of described it. There is some really neat practical things that are happening, and even if it's not kind of formalized within academic, an academic publication, it's existing in the community, and that's really heartening as somebody who comes from a community research perspective. We're kind of continuing to share more information about the zine and other resources through conferences. We presented at the BC School Council's conference, presented at the Child and Youth Care Community Wellness event. We're presenting here. The zine has received quite a bit of downloads, much more downloads than any other publication I've put out there in my short academic career. And it's over 1,265 downloads in the time that it was put out in September until now, and 900 plus downloads in Canada, 200 plus downloads in the States. We've been doing some media discussions about anti-Asian racism. And again, there was a publication that was out in the BC Psychologist, which you could also gain access to from our website. Some of our next steps, we've been contacted by groups, one group regarding needing to develop an anti-Asian racism support group. And so we were actually able to receive some funding to do that. And so that's kind of the next steps that's connected to this project. There's also, lots of resources about Asian Americans, but not much in terms of Asian Canadian mental health. And so we are using our website to create it as kind of a hosting place for the zine, but also as a mental health hub. And if we kind of continue to get funding, that's something that we want to continue to refine. And I think there's also opportunities for creative spaces and creative ways to disseminate knowledge, such as podcasts, etc. And then kind of what we're kind of beginning to think about is how do we make this information, our journey, what we were doing, as something that's can be understood, can be kind of shared within academic spaces. So we're going to begin to write a publication around the idea of zine making as mental health and anti-racist praxis, and then also wrestle with different tensions. Zines are about kind of creating, it kind of has this historical place of pushing against hegemony, but then academic circles as well. There's kind of this idea of what knowledge is legitimate, and zines are kind of in that space of being able to share information that could be accessible, but may not be seen as legitimate knowledge, at least in the academic ivory towers. And so we want to kind of explore our reflections around that, write about our journey, and kind of continue to share creative ideas that something like this can be used, or other creative ways can be done to make this type of knowledge accessible to the community. So this was just our take of it. This is the way that we kind of journeyed through the storm of the COVID-19, and obviously it continues. COVID-19 continues. Anti-Asian racism continues. Something like this doesn't solve the world's problems, but it is a contribution. And we really want to, learn from you. What are your reflections around anti-racism, about mental health, pedagogy, and praxis? How has COVID-19 and its intersection with racism and mental health influenced you personally and professionally? How have you engaged in anti-racism work, in reflection and practice? And how do you see something like this zine, or other types of tools that you might have come across being used in the spaces that you occupy in your teaching, in your practice? You know, I think all of us are engaged in some sort of practice, whether it be teaching, whether it be clinical practice, whether we are students. And so I think we're all kind of affected by this in different ways. So I want to just kind of create that space for us just to talk. So we have about 10 minutes. I'm not sure how many folks are here.
I have folks assigned into breakout rooms of 3, if that's okay, Fred.
Perfect, yeah. So is that okay? I'm not sure if you'll have these questions, so I might have to just type it out afterwards. But if we could just kind of break you all off into breakout rooms for like 10 minutes, and then we'll kind of reconvene and just have a conversation.
Okay.
Courtney, if you could.
Yeah, here we go. Now, for the people who are still here, Fred, Catherine, Tanya, Macayla, do any of you want to be in a breakout room?
Sure.
Feel free to put me in a breakout room. Yeah.
Okay. Hold on here.
I don't think they have those questions though, so I'm not sure if I should type it out.
Maybe if you can put them in the chat.
No, I'll broadcast them out.
Okay.
So y'all should be, sorry, give me a second here. There's just a lot going on at the moment. Let me just do it.
Thanks, Courtney.
No problem.
I can assign Catherine to a breakout room
Sure.
here.
Yeah, if you want to do the assigns, I will broadcast the questions.
Okay, and then Macayla and Fred, were you wanting to join any breakout rooms?
Yeah, send us to some random breakout
Okay, great. I'll assign you to different rooms then. And here we go. Hi, folks. Welcome back from the breakout rooms. I trust that you had a great discussion of those questions, or at least one or two of them. So I wonder, Fred and Macayla, was there another component to your talk today?
Yeah, actually, there's just some things that we want to just wrap up. I would be really curious to learn from what people were sharing. But maybe we'll just wrap up our last little piece and then maybe just open it up for just a discussion, whether it be about what we presented or some of these reflection questions that we posed for all of you. So let me just kind of pull up my screen here. 1 second. There we go.
Okay, so thank you all for coming to this presentation. We just want to note on solidarity, because the zine very intentionally was named Growth and Solidarity, because anti-Asian racism is interconnected with other forms of oppression and colonialism. We can't separate them. It's also important to remember that while facing harm, we can also perpetuate it. And that's why that accountability piece was so important for us to include in the zine. And so while healing and growth are necessary, racial justice also requires solidarity and action. We need to be concrete and material with our changes as well. And so we leave you with some questions to ponder, and you can discuss with other people, journal, do whatever you may do to really grapple with them. But so what does solidarity look like in academic institutions with colonial histories? How can you be an anti-racist educator, researcher, administrator, etc.? What must be changed for the university to be anti-racist? And how can you practice anti-racism outside of your professional life too? Because the personal is professional and political, and the professional is personal and political. So I really hope that you can take some time to be very honest with yourself about these questions, because they're not easy and they can be really vulnerable. So yeah, find your people that you can talk about it with.
Yeah, thank you everyone for yeah, those are easy questions to kind of leave off with, but we hope that it's a good and comfort. And so we want to say thank you for everyone just to kind of allow us to have the space to share our journey through this storm as we continue to journey through the storm. And these are some of the resources if you're interested in that. Again, our website is growthandsolidarity.ca. You can find the zine there. It's free and available to anyone who's interested. Yeah, and I just wanted to kind of open it up. We have about 5 minutes. If there's any questions, comments, discussions, anything that you kind of want to share from your reflections in your breakout rooms.
So maybe if you could just type in the chat, if you have a question, you could just type the word question and then or if you have a reflection or a comment, we'll just be looking at the chat and we'll invite you to unmute yourself. So I think while people are thinking of their questions and reflections, I'll just offer a reflection to say that I really appreciated both from Fred and Macayla, your transparency about the research process and how you personally were transformed by the experience. We don't often hear about that in research. We often have a focus on an output, but learning about the process and how it impacted you personally, how you experienced growth and how you found solidarity yourselves. I think that was very meaningful for me. And I found that, really impactful. So thank you for sharing that. We have a couple of comments. N. Fitzgerald said thank you. And Sally said it was a pleasure to meet you, Naomi. Okay.
And just wanted to add to that, it is a humbling process. I think as a psychologist, academic, and Macayla is doing some really neat work around professional saviorism. This is humbling for me, kind of thinking that I had this brilliant idea to share with the community, but in actuality, there's sometimes a little bit of a professional arrogance to that, and so I think all of us kind of coming together and humbling ourselves was really kind of what we wanted to embody in the zine.
Thanks, Fred. And I see we have a question from Jordan in the chat. For youth or young adults who are maybe thinking about wanting to start a zine, what were some of the hurdles that you ran into, if any, that might be helpful to be aware of?
Maybe I'll let Macayla answer that. She's more proficient at zining than I am.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the process of making zines is so open and that can feel kind of intimidating. And so what I really appreciate about this process is that, I wasn't creating a zine alone, or it wasn't just me and Quisa, and that we did have a team. And so I would really encourage anyone making a zine to do it in relationship with other people, to have, your ideas shared and for other people to read over it, edit it. Because zines are really relational, and so they ought to be created that way as well. It's so interesting, hurdles. And we also created a zine in a very different context within an academic institution. So our hurdles might be different than a youth just wanting to create a zine more personally, but I don't know. I would definitely encourage everyone here to support youth in your lives if they want to create zines and share their knowledge, because I think youth are really, really smart and deserve to have platforms where they can speak to their experiences.
Great, thanks for that. Oh, so go ahead, Fred.
Yeah, I think there's some really creative opportunities. Like if I put on my counselor hat on, it's just the idea of zining it's part of this kind of resistant history, resistant to kind of dominant forms of knowledge, and a way to situate experiences and lived experiences and kind of having a space to acknowledge that. So I think even as a counselor, like, creating a zine together with maybe a client or youth, like I think there's some really neat things that can come out of that. And if you look at kind of the zine world, there's some really neat stuff that's happening out there. You have this one zine that you have a collective of people trying to understand ways to deconstruct suicide, and how do we kind of help people who are dealing with suicide and them bringing together and collaborating and creating zines together. There's some who look at the intersections between their racial identity and mental health, and so there's some really not only as kind of something that could be created, but also opportunity and space for us to also learn from, because it doesn't just have to be from academic papers.
Yeah, there's lots of zines out there. I would definitely encourage everyone here to read zines. There's some great ones about, like the difference between being an ally and a co-conspirator, and yeah, how to really engage with anti-racism in very critical ways.
Well, thanks for that question, Jordan. It seemed to spark a lot of great thoughts. And we just had one other comment in the chat from Catherine, that she agreed it was a good point that you made, I think, to the previous comment, and that we co-construct knowledge that benefits us all. So very much in keeping with what we've been talking about here. And we've reached time. So I just want to say a really heartfelt thanks to Fred and Macayla for this meaningful and significant presentation today. Look at all these hands clapping. It really, I think, was such an engaging conversation for all of us. I also want to thank the members of the team that made this magic happen. So Courtney has been a technical whiz. Thank you, Courtney, for your technical support during today's session. And also Courtney's been managing the Eventbrite registration page, so thank you for that. Thank you, Lauren, for your support with communications and for getting the message out on social media. And Elaine's not here, but Elaine Laberge was the graphic design genius behind this poster you see here, and also behind some of the conceptual development for the title of the series. So we'll be continuing next week with 2 presentations on Wednesday, May 12th. We have the first presentation is titled The Role of Self-Regulatory Competencies in Mediating the Impact of COVID-19 Distress on Academic Success. And our presenters are Alison Hadwin, Puina Sukwahawamthakul, Ramin Rostampur, and Michelle Bahena Olivares from Educational Psychology. And our second presentation is on mental health and resilience experiences of university students during the COVID-19 pandemic, implications for mental health service delivery and policy development. And this will be presented by Dr. Gillian Roberts, Bianca Humbert, Robin McMillan, and Dr. Celeste Duff, also from Educational Psychology. And last but not least, thank all of you for joining us today. It was really great to see all your faces here, and we hope that we can count on your participation again at our next session next week, and we'll be continuing every Wednesday this month. So thanks again, Fred and Macayla, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Hopefully see you soon. Bye.